Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us, there's a really good chance you have, managed some sort of project before.
Right, like a software rollout or maybe a marketing campaign.
Yeah, or even just like a kitchen renovation that completely jumped the tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Because you start with this pristine plan, right?
Yeah.
A set of blueprints where the math is absolute and it just feels deterministic.
Oh, exactly. You assume if you just plug in the materials and the labor, out pops this finished product.
But then you step into the actual physical world. You hit, I don't know, supply chain crashes or unpredictable weather, or your client completely shifts their demands.
And suddenly you're looking at an operational landscape that is just pure chaos waiting to happen.
Pure chaos. And on a multi-million or, multi-billion-dollar construction site, that unpredictability doesn't just cause headaches.
No, it causes absolute financial ruin if it isn't maintained. I mean, it's the literal definition of managing continuous unpredictability.
Which brings us to the really fascinating stack of source material we have on the table today. We are going to answer the question of how these massive, complex projects don't just immediately derail into decade-long lawsuits the second something goes wrong.
And the answer to that, surprisingly enough, is a checklist.
Yeah, literally a checklist. Specifically, we're looking at the FIDI Red Book 2017 Variation Checklist for Clause 13.
Yeah.
And I mean, at first glance, this is just a legal matrix of yes, no, and not applicable boxes.
Intended for the engineer, the employer, and the contractor to fill out. And I will admit, to the untrained eye, it looks like, well, the most tedious piece of bureaucracy imaginable.
It really does. But okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today for you, the listener, is to decode this incredibly dense legal document to uncover the brilliant step-by-step logic hidden inside of it.
Right, we're going to explore what the industry calls the checklist approach.
Exactly, the checklist approach and the variation workflow. Because we want to show you how this simple procedural checklist acts as this highly engineered conflict resolution machine.
What's fascinating here is that, if you look past the checkboxes themselves, you're actually looking at a behavioral forcing function.
Oh, I like that term.
Yeah, this workflow anticipates human nature, financial panic, the actual physical limits of reality. It takes this terrifying, chaotic concept of change and forces everyone into a highly structured, predictable set of actions.
So to understand how that machine works, we really first have to establish who actually holds the power to throw a wrench into the original plan. Because before we look at how things change, we have to look at who initiates it.
And when they can initiate it.
Right. So according to subclause 13.1 of the checklist, the engineer is the one who initiates a variation. And they can trigger this at any time before something called the taking over certificate is issued.
Right, and just for context, the taking over certificate is essentially this milestone document. It states that the physical work is substantially complete and the employer, so the entity actually funding the project, is taking possession of the site.
Handing over the keys, basically.
Okay. Exactly. So the contract dictates that right up until the very last possible moment before handover, the engineer has this sweeping authority to change the plan.
And we're not just talking about adjusting the paint color here. The checklist explicitly says variations can include changes to the quantities of work, the quality of the materials.
Changes of the structures, yeah.
Yeah, they can even add entirely new scope or completely upend the sequence of the construction. The engineer is acting on behalf of the employer, steering the ship.
Oh.
And here's the part that made me stop reading and do a double-take item number 5 on the checklist.
Yes, the compliance requirement.
Right. It says, the contractor was bound by and executed with due expedition and without delay each variation instructed. I mean, I have to push back on this. Are you telling me the contractor just has to blindly execute whatever the engineer dictates? It's like a chef being told halfway through cooking a steak that it actually needs to be a cake. Like, what if the materials are stuck on a cargo ship somewhere? Or what if the new design is literally physically dangerous? It sounds like a dictatorship.
I see why you draw that conclusion, absolutely. Yeah. But a multi-billion-dollar contract, it cannot survive as a dictatorship. The FIDI updates specifically anticipate that exact pushback.
Okay. So there's a way out.
There are rigorous release valves built in, yeah. Located right there in checklist item number 3. If the contractor objects to the instruction, they don't just fold their arms and refuse to work. They are required to promptly give a formal notice.
But they can't just issue a notice saying hey, we don't want to do this because it's annoying, right?
No, correct. The checklist forces them to ground that objection in physical or legal reality. They must state, with detailed supporting particulars, that the varied work is unforeseeable.
Or I guess that goods cannot readily be obtained, right? That's what it
Yeah,
says here.
exactly. That protects the contractor from being legally bound to perform, like, supply chain miracles.
Okay. Or, looking at it here, they can object if the variation adversely affects compliance with health and safety under subclause 4.8.
Or the protection of the environment under subclause 4.18. Notice the workflow this creates, though.
Right.
The contractor gives this formal notice based on safety, environment, or supply chain reality. Then, checklist item number 4 demands that the engineer promptly responds by giving a notice to either cancel, confirm, or vary the instruction.
Okay, so it's a dialogue.
It's the checklist approach in action. It prevents the site supervisor and the engineering lead from just, screaming at each other in the mud while the project bleeds money. It forces a highly structured dialogue where concerns are documented and resolved on the record.
I see the logic. It de-escalates the immediate conflict by wrapping it in heavy procedure. So let's assume a change is allowed, the objections are cleared, the instruction is confirmed. How does that change actually make its way from an abstract idea into physical concrete?
Well, this takes us right into the core variation procedure. And the checklist shows there are 2 primary paths. We have variation by instruction, which is the top-down order we just discussed.
Right.
And then variation by request for proposal, where the engineer essentially asks the contractor to draft a plan for a potential change before officially ordering it.
But regardless of which path triggers it, the workflow immediately kicks into high gear with this very strict, unforgiving timer.
The 28-day rule.
Yes. Once initiated, the contractor has exactly 28 days to submit detailed particulars.
And we aren't talking about a back-of-the-napkin estimate here. Subclause 13.3.1 requires a full description of the varied work, the specific methods they'll use, a modified schedule showing how it impacts the final delivery date,
And a detailed proposal for how much this is going to adjust the overall contract price based on the valuation rules in Clause 12. Which, I have a serious problem with this 28-day rule.
Oh, how so?
Well, if I'm the contractor, and I'm already managing thousands of workers and hundreds of daily crises, forcing me to stop and generate a massively detailed, legally binding cost and time proposal within 28 days. That seems so counterproductive. Doesn't that heavy administrative burden distract them from actually building the thing?
It sounds like it would. But let's test that logic by looking at the alternative.
Wow.
Historically and honestly still today on poorly managed contracts, here's what happens. A change is ordered.
Okay.
The contractor executes it immediately because they want to keep the job moving and avoid delay penalties, right?
Sure. Makes sense.
But they don't formally agree on the new price or the valuation method under Clause 12. Fast forward 3 years, the building is finished, the contractor submits their final bill, and suddenly there is a $50 million gap between what the employer wants to pay and what the contractor claims it cost them in labor and disruption.
Oh, wow. Which just guarantees a decade of litigation.
Precisely. The brilliance of this 28-day workflow is that it forces both parties to quantify the impact of a change immediately, while the reality of the situation is fresh.
I noticed the checklist actually tracks the exact date of commencement for the engineer's time limit to agree.
Yeah.
It acts like a literal stopwatch for accountability.
Yes. The contractor does not halt the physical work. The checklist ensures they proceed with execution, but the administrative gears are forced to turn in the background in real time. It forces the physical reality of the site and the financial budget to stay perfectly synced.
Okay, that clarifies the top-down approach. We know how the engineer forces a change and how the 28-day rule stops delayed financial explosions. But what if the people actually doing the work, the contractors, spot a massive inefficiency?
Right.
Like, how do they pitch a better idea without breaching the contract? Because here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
This is where the checklist introduces a mechanism called value engineering.
And this is arguably one of the most sophisticated elements of the entire FIDIC framework, because it acknowledges that the engineer doesn't hold a monopoly on good ideas.
Exactly. The checklist outlines that the contractor can proactively submit a written proposal to accelerate completion, reduce costs, or improve efficiency. And if the engineer consents, at the employer's sole discretion, it officially becomes a variation.
But there's a catch.
Yeah, there is. Checklist item 5 specifies that if this proposal involves a design change, the contractor has to design that part at their own cost. And I'm just thinking, why on earth would a contractor spend their own engineering budget to design a change that ultimately saves the employer money?
It seems like a terrible deal, right? Until you read the phrasing in checklist item number 4, it references the sharing of benefit, costs, and on-door delay per the particular condition.
The sharing of benefit, that's the hook right there.
Exactly. It's a built-in incentive structure. Let's apply this to a real scenario. Imagine a contractor is building a massive suspension bridge. Their ground team realizes that by altering the design of the underwater caissons, they can shave 2 months off the pouring schedule and save $5 million in raw materials. The employer gets the bridge finished faster and cheaper.
Right.
But through value engineering, the contract allows the contractor to take a negotiated cut of those $5 million in savings.
Oh, wow. So it totally transforms the contractor from a passive executor of orders into an active, financially motivated problem solver.
It does. But notice how the checklist restrains that innovation. The checklist ensures this creative problem-solving still follows the exact same rigorous tracking as an enforced change.
Right. They still have to do the notices, safety guarantees, scheduling impacts.
Yep. It harnesses their on-the-ground expertise but keeps it safely within the project's boundaries, making sure a clever shortcut doesn't accidentally compromise structural integrity just to save a few bucks.
It's like innovation on a leash. I love that. So we've talked about massive design overhauls and strategic value engineering. But anyone who has ever built anything knows that sometimes managing chaos isn't about redesigning a roof.
Right.
Sometimes it's literally just about paying for an extra truckload of gravel that wasn't in the original budget. Not all changes are massive.
The minutia, which in the construction industry is a notorious legal loophole that can cause just as many disputes as the big architectural changes if you don't lock it down.
And the checklist dedicates 2 specific workflows to managing this minutia: provisional sums and day work. Let's look at provisional sums first. The checklist defines these as buckets of money set aside in the contract for specific anticipated unknowns.
Right.
But item 1 says they can only be used via the engineer's explicit instructions. And item 6 requires all applicable invoices, vouchers, and receipts in substantiation of the provisional sum.
Think of a provisional sum as an escrow account. When you sign the initial contract, you know you will need some amount of money for, say, stabilizing unpredictable soil.
Because you can't see underground.
Exactly. You can't price it accurately until you start digging. The provisional sum ring fences a budget for that soil work, but the checklist ensures the contractor can't just treat that bucket of money as a slush fund to pad their profit margins. Every dollar must be proven.
And then there's day work. This is for work of a, and I'm quoting here, minor or incidental nature. Now, you're probably familiar with the concept of paying a mechanic for labor by the hour plus parts rather than a flat fee for the whole car repair.
Sure.
But the level of extreme micromanagement required by the FIDA checklist here is wild. The contractor must deliver daily accurate statements of the exact resources used the previous day, in duplicate, plus an electronic copy, and the engineer has to sign off on it every single day.
It seems exhausting, I know. But day work is historically the most inefficient, easily abused mechanism in construction. Without daily verification, it is incredibly easy for hours to be inflated or materials to be misallocated.
But there is this really sharp, strategic safeguard built into the day work workflow for the materials themselves. If the contractor needs to order goods for the day work, they submit quotes to the engineer.
And this is where the 7-day rule comes in.
Yes. Checklist item 4 says the engineer must instruct acceptance of one quotation within 7 days. If the engineer misses that 7-day window, the contractor is legally entitled to accept any quotation at their own discretion and just proceed.
And that 7-day rule is such a vital mechanism. Imagine a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project grinding to a complete halt because an engineer's office is taking 3 weeks to approve a $500 invoice for extra cement.
Right. The employer could lose millions in delay costs over nothing.
Exactly. By granting the contractor the power to proceed after 7 days, the workflow forces the employer's administrative side to be just as responsive and accountable as the contractor's side. It systematically prevents bureaucratic bottlenecks from holding physical progress hostage.
It's such a perfect illustration of how the checklist balances power.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered changes originating from the top down via the engineer, bottom up via the contractor, and the daily friction of the minutia.
But what happens when the outside world intervenes?
Right. Changes originating entirely outside the physical fence of the site. This brings us to macroeconomic and geopolitical risk. The final workflows in the document. Adjustments for changes in laws and adjustments for changes in cost. Let's start with laws.
Okay.
The checklist outlines that the contract price can be adjusted if there are new laws, repealed laws, or, this is key, changed governmental interpretations of existing laws that happen after what the contract calls the base date.
And the base date is a really critical concept here. It's typically set 28 days before the latest date for submitting the tender.
Right.
It represents the exact moment the contractor locked in their price based on the legal and economic rules of reality at that specific second in time.
Right, because imagine a scenario where the government suddenly introduces massive new tariffs on imported steel halfway through building a stadium. The contractor couldn't possibly have priced that geopolitical event into their original bid.
No, they couldn't.
So the checklist recognizes their entitlement to an adjustment. But it's a two-way street. If a new law causes a decrease in cost, say a massive tax break on certain materials, the employer gets a reduction in the contract price.
The variation workflow is designed to maintain the fundamental economic balance of the original deal, regardless of how the government alters the playing field.
And that exact same logic applies to changes in cost. The checklist verifies that amounts payable are adjusted for rises or falls in the cost of labor, goods, and inputs based on a schedule of cost indexation. Basically, formulaic inflation protection.
Right.
So what does this all mean? When you look at checklist item number 6, there's a mechanism here that I just find brilliant.
Ah, you're referring to the penalty clause regarding the time for completion.
It is a phenomenal built-in punishment. It states that if the contractor fails to complete the works on time, the price adjustment uses either the index applicable 49 days before the expiry of the time for completion or the current index, whichever is more favorable to the employer.
Let's explore the psychological mechanism behind that, because it solves a massive moral hazard in long-term contracting. Picture a scenario where a contractor is running behind schedule, but global inflation is currently skyrocketing.
Okay, bad situation.
Right, but if their contract adjusts payouts based on current inflation indexes, they might actually realize that dragging their feet and delaying the project further makes them more money.
Wait, really?
Yeah, because the indexation formula keeps raising their payouts faster than their actual costs are rising.
Oh my gosh, they would be incentivized to be slow.
Exactly. But this 49-day rule slices that perverse incentive right out of the contract. If you're dragging your feet, your project is late, and the price of steel goes up too bad.
The employer gets to use the old, cheaper index from 49 days before you're supposed to be finished.
Right. You completely lose out on the inflation adjustment specifically because you failed to perform on time.
The checklist ensures that macroeconomic risks, like sudden supply shocks or inflation, are accounted for fairly so the contractor doesn't go bankrupt. But it categorically refuses to let them game the math to subsidize their own poor performance.
It's risk allocation at its finest. Systematic and fair.
It really is a comprehensive machine. I mean, when we started this deep dive, we talked about how a multi-million-dollar construction site is essentially chaos waiting to happen.
Yeah.
But looking closely at this FID checklist, notice proposal, execution, valuation.
It sanitizes the chaos.
Exactly. It takes the terrifying project-killing concept of change and turns it into a highly predictable workflow. Whether you're dealing with a massive design shift, the daily friction of an hourly laborer's timesheet, or a sudden unexpected change in international tariff law, there is a box to check.
A timeline to follow and a mathematical formula to resolve the conflict. And we have to remember that this document wasn't drafted in a vacuum. It evolved over decades of painful, expensive experience. Every single one of those checkboxes, every 28-day limit, and every rigorous notification requirement represents a past project that ended in disaster and litigation because that specific step wasn't followed.
It's basically written in the blood and bankruptcies of past contractors.
It really is. And before we go, I want you, the listener, to think about the broader implications of this. We've just spent this deep dive analyzing how this rigorous checklist approach prevents billion-dollar disputes. It forces formal notices, strict 28-day estimates, and mathematically shared benefits.
Right.
What if you applied this exact variation workflow to the inevitable changes in your own life? The next time a client shifts software requirements at work, or when you find yourself constantly moving the goalposts on your own personal goals? What if you required yourself to formally issue a notice of variation? What if, before agreeing to a change, you forced yourself to calculate the exact cost in time, energy, and resources within a strict 28-day window?
That is fascinating.
Would applying this rigid contract logic to your daily life stifle your flexibility? Or would it finally be the cure for the modern plague of perpetual scope creep?
Imagine issuing a formal subclause 13.1 notice to your boss before accepting a new project. I mean, it might just save your sanity. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of managing chaos. Till next time, keep questioning the blueprint.
Download the free PDF checklist from our website. See the link in the description. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and see you next time.